Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending today's virtual event, Made at the Library, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials, with author Allison Finkelstein. Please note that, as mentioned on the slides, um, that the session is being recorded. So if you choose to participate in the Q&A session at the end, your comments or questions will be included in the recording as part of the event. My name is Elizabeth Navarra, and I'm a historian who specializes in American women's history in the manuscript division here at the Library of Congress. And joining me in hosting today's discussion is my colleague Sherry Hsu, who specializes in modern American history, and they also work in the manuscript division. And our guest speaker today is Allison Finkelstein. Welcome, Allison. Um, Allison earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also studied historic preservation. Her first book, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials: How American Women Commemorated the Great War from 1917 to 1945, is the topic of today's book talk. And this book was published by University of Alabama Press in 2021 and also released in paperback in September 2023. It won the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference's 2022 Arline Custer Memorial Award for Best Book. From 2017 to 2018, the Arlington County Board appointed Allison as the chair of the Arlington World War I Commemoration Task Force. In that position, she led the task force in the creation of interpretive panels at the Clarendon War Memorial, a project that won the 2020 National Alliance of Preservation Commission's Excellence Award in the category of Best Practices in Public Outreach and Advocacy. So thank you, Allison, for being with us today and for this conversation about your book on women in World War I. I'm going to turn things over to you now to give us a broad overview of your book. And after that presentation, we're going to delve into your book in greater detail with a discussion session, and then we'll open the floor up to a Q&A session with the audience.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna get my slides up here. All right, can you guys see them? Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone out there in the virtual audience. Thank you, Liz, for that really kind introduction. And thanks again to you, Liz, to Hsu, and to the Manuscript Division for hosting me, as well as Elizabeth there behind the scenes. After spending so many hours researching in the Manuscript Division and at the Library of Congress, I'm really honored to be sharing the fruits of that work with the library's audience. Before I start, though, I have one brief housekeeping item to take care of. While I work in my day job as a historian for the U.S. Army, my presentation today and my book are completely separate from my job. I am in no way representing the U.S. Army or the federal government through this presentation or through my book. So with that out of the way, I can go ahead and get started. In my brief opening remarks, I'm going to quickly introduce the topic and argument of my book. I will then showcase some of the Manuscript Division collections that I used in my research before we launch into that main discussion portion of the program with Liz and Hsu. And then at the end, I'm really looking forward to taking your questions. My book investigates how American women who served or sacrificed during World War I commemorated that conflict. And I argue in the book that these female activists considered their community service and veterans advocacy projects to be forms of commemoration just as significant and effective as traditional memorialization methods, such as monuments and statues. What I mean is that these women sometimes preferred projects that helped a broadly defined group of male and female veterans as an alternative to physical monuments and memorials. In my book, I refer to this as veteranism, which is a word that I created and made up to describe this ideology more succinctly. So if you haven't heard of the term before, that's okay. It's because I created it just for this book, and we can talk more about that later. So throughout the program, you will hear me use the term veteranism, and I will call the women that I study veteranists. The projects that these women veteranists organized are the invisible memorials of the book's title. They ranged from memorial buildings that housed service activities to intangible projects like raising money for destitute female veterans. No matter their form or their temporary nature, these women considered such efforts to be memorials, even though they were nothing like the monuments and statues being sculpted in marble or created in bronze throughout the US and Europe at the time. It's important to note, however, that female veteranists did not always completely reject traditional commemoration. They took steps forward and backward as they developed veteranism. They disagreed with each other very often, and they sometimes supported more traditional memorials or incorporated aspects of them into their service-based projects. But they always worked to maintain service as their chief concern. Throughout their commemorative work, then, these women emphasized that they too had served and sacrificed during the war, and that they had contributed to the Allied victory in some way. For many of them, this service and sacrifice took the form of motherhood, whether by being the mother of a service member or by losing a child and becoming a Gold Star mother, like the ones we see here at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on Memorial Day in 1927. But other women also insisted that they should be considered actual veterans of the war, even if they did not meet the military's very strict and exclusive criteria for who constituted a veteran. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that later, but this really only applied to a very limited group of women. The women who were not considered veterans, they advocated on their own behalf to try and gain the veteran status and benefits they believed they had earned during the war. And this effort was considered by many of them to be a form of commemoration in and of itself. In my book, I refer to these women as unrecognized veterans, and they are the forgotten veterans of the book's title. They pioneered important new fields like telephone operation and physical therapy, and they paved the way for more women to have future opportunities in the armed forces. Yet today, their work too often remains forgotten, and their impact on American commemorative culture and the longer trajectory of American women's military service is too frequently overlooked. On the tails of yesterday's observance of Veterans Day, I hope that their stories will be rediscovered and that their contributions to our nation will be recognized and honored. To capture the story of these women and their unconventional memorial projects, each of my book's chapters focuses on a specific topic. I like to think of these chapters like 5 connected case studies. The book begins with the Women's Overseas Service League, which was an American organization that united women who served overseas in any capacity during World War I. It was known as the WOSL, or the League, and it operated as a veterans organization much like the American Legion. The WOSL was truly the main leader of veteranism. The League often repeated its belief that, quote, "the greatest memorial to the dead is service to the living." This concept infused all of their work, and it really impacted the larger female veteranist community. The next chapters focus on the veteranist activities pursued by 3 more organizations: the American Red Cross, the World War Reconstruction AIDS Association, and the American War Mothers. The final chapter of the book examines the Gold Star Mothers and Widows pilgrimages of the 1930s. Organized and fully funded by the government, these remarkable trips took the mothers and widows of service members who were buried or memorialized at the American overseas military cemeteries on trips to visit those sites. And I argue that these pilgrimages were a form of a veteranist memorial dedicated to the Gold Star women themselves. In the book's conclusion, the story takes us into World War II, and it uncovers how the women of the World War I generation fought for the World War II women to gain the benefits and status they themselves had lacked. Their advocacy, it really impacted the future of military women for years to come. I'm sure that we're going to cover many of these topics in more detail during our discussion. So I'm going to move on now and talk a bit about how I use the manuscript division's collections as I researched my book. Like so many other scholars, LOC materials were critical to my research in both obvious and unexpected ways. The collection most clearly linked to my research is, of course, the records of the American Gold Star Mothers Incorporated. Established in 1928, this organization connected women who had lost their children during World War I, and it became a leading advocate for their concerns. Most importantly, it lobbied for the government to organize and fully fund the Gold Star pilgrimages, which eventually took place from 1930 to 1933. Among the many records in this collection are the applications for membership. These often contain valuable information about the deceased children of the Gold Star mothers, and they sometimes even include photos which can be hard to find. Here on the screen, you see the application submitted by the organization's own founder, Grace Darling-Siebold. And even though I did not end up using all of the information I found in these membership applications, when I combined them with stories I found at other repositories, these documents really helped me piece together the stories of the women who went on the pilgrimages. Another collection that was a very easy fit for my project was the Mabel Thorpe Boardman Papers. An influential longtime leader of the American Red Cross, who was also a member of the Women's Overseas Service League, Mabel Boardman turned out to be a main character in my chapter about the American Red Cross. Under her leadership, the Red Cross created a living memorial to the women who served in World War I. This living memorial, which we see here, was located at the Red Cross's DC headquarters, and it took the form of a memorial building. So this memorial building, it housed Red Cross service activities, while it also functioned as a piece of neoclassical architecture. I think of it as a hybrid memorial that embraced the tenets of veteranism without foregoing the more formal aesthetics of statuary memorials. Mabel Boardman was quite a strong personality, I learned, and her papers in the manuscript division provided me with insight into her work, especially when combined with other records at the National Archives and the headquarters of the Red Cross. Perhaps a little bit less obvious, but maybe even more essential to my research, were the John J. Pershing papers. As the head of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I, General Pershing led the American military force that fought overseas. He became a national hero and a celebrity, and he remained invested in the memory of the war and those impacted by it for the remainder of his life. Scattered throughout his papers are examples of his many interactions with the female veteranists of my book. These included everybody from Gold Star mothers to members of the Women's Overseas Service League. I found these materials by reviewing the finding aid for the collection and requesting items from Pershing's correspondence files. I looked for keywords related to my research, words such as American War Mothers, Women's Overseas Service League, or World War Women Veterans. These folders ended up yielding all sorts of interesting documents, and they revealed a paper trail of how Pershing interacted with the women in my book. They also provided information about the activities and projects of these women that helped me understand the work of female veteranists much better. And I learned an important lesson through this research as a young historian. Look beyond the most obvious records related to your research question. Dig into collections that are relevant, but not necessarily a perfect match, because you never know what you will find. Finally, I also utilized the Mary Church Terrell papers. I consulted this collection as I worked on adding more about how African American women took part in veteranism. This proved challenging because all too often, Black women were excluded from fully participating in veteranist activities and organizations due to racism. So I needed to expand my research beyond my main case studies, and I started to look into the lives of female leaders who were Black and also participated in World War I. This took me to Mary Church Terrell. Though she was best known as a leader of civil rights issues and women's suffrage, during World War I, Mary Church Terrell worked for the War Camp Community Service, which was an organization that ran recreational programs for troops at military camps. And here you can see a picture of Mary Church Terrell next to a poster for the War Camp Community Service. And that poster features at its center an elderly white woman who contrasts very starkly with Mary Church Terrell. I did my research in the Mary Church Terrell papers entirely online during 2020. The digitization efforts of the manuscript division really saved me. I couldn't do in-person research because of the pandemic, but I could still access the records I needed. I just had to think a little bit more creatively about my research and expand the scope of my story beyond the first couple obvious groups I looked at. And this is really essential when trying to recover the contributions made by marginalized minority groups. During my research, I also utilized materials from other divisions at the Library of Congress. These included historic newspapers, World War I posters, sheet music, and many, many, many photographs. Suffice it to say, I could not have published my book without the library's resources. With this short introduction, you now know the basics of my book, so we can dive into the conversation with our experts from the manuscript division and then take our audience questions. So back to you, Liz and Shu. I'll let you take it from here.
Allison, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and also for taking the time to join us today. And just to begin with, can you just talk a little bit more about how you decided to select the topic for the book and why it's important to you?
Yes, thank you. So it's kind of one of those long and winding stories, as many historians will tell you when answering this question. So I will try to be brief. There's two experiences that led me to the book topic. The first was that in between college and graduate school, I had this incredible opportunity to be a teaching assistant in the history and drama departments of a British boarding school. And these British kids every year go on a field trip to the Western Front because it's just a drive across the Channel. We actually took the school minivan into the Channel over to France and went to the Western Front. And when I was there with these kids and my fellow teachers, I saw how vivid the memory of World War I still remained for the British people, that they still take these students to the battlefields, they study World War I poetry, and I was struck with the contrast by my own experiences as a student in the US and how little I had learned about World War I. And I started to wonder about a big question. And that question was, why doesn't the United States remember World War I in the way that Britain, Belgium, and France do? And there's obvious answers, right? That the war didn't happen here on this soil, that we came in later. But to me, it seemed there was more there. And I kept thinking about this question and eventually came back to it in graduate school. And this book is my effort to take a tiny slice of that question and answer it. The second experience was that in graduate school, I had an amazing opportunity to do a couple summer internships at the American Battle Monuments Commission, the ABMC. That is the agency that still to this day runs the overseas World War I and World War II cemeteries and memorials. And during those internships, we did a lot of research at the National Archives and at the Library of Congress about the Gold Star pilgrimages. We were trying to find information about service members buried at the cemetery. And by digging into Gold Star mothers and widows' records, you could actually get a lot of information about their sons and their husbands. So that experience really opened up my eyes to that topic, which eventually led me to narrow that original bigger question of why doesn't the US pay as much attention to the memory of World War I, to make it smaller and more manageable and ask, how did American women commemorate the war?
Yeah, narrowing down those research questions is always so important. So once you narrowed down your research questions, how did you really grapple with sort of finding the archival materials that you needed to use for your dissertation and for the eventual book? And sort of how did you go about just trying to figure out which sources would be useful to you?
So that internship at the American Battle Monuments Commission, it really helped guide me in the right direction, because we're here at the Library of Congress, looking through the Gold Star Mothers records. And as I was looking through them, I realized that there were a lot of other sources in there that were not relevant to the project I was working on, but could lead me somewhere else for a possible dissertation. Likewise, a lot of the records that I was looking at the National Archives, particularly for the Gold Star pilgrimages, put me in touch with finding aids that gave me a hint about other projects I could look at. So I started to see mentions of women's memorials and groups of women. And when I went back to school in the fall semester, I returned to the National Archives and the Library of Congress and started pulling on those threads that I had found. And as any historian or researcher knows, once you pull on one string, it leads you to about 50 more, and then you have to figure out what you have to take out. But that's sort of what helped me get in the right direction. And from there, I really just tried to listen to the sources. And I want to highlight a couple things to answer your question that came from the Library of Congress itself. So here is an example of two of the membership applications from your American Gold Star Mothers records. And I had looked at these when I was doing my research for the American Battle Monuments Commission. But it took me later in my dissertation research to really parse out the story of this mother, Elizabeth Conley. And you can see that there's two applications here for her, one for her son Francis and one for her son William. One of them was missing and one of them was found and identified. And in my research, I discovered that she changed her mind 5 times about where she wanted her identified son to be buried. She wasn't sure if she wanted him buried overseas or if she wanted him taken home, because she was so distraught about losing both of her sons, but only having one set of remains. She never knew what happened to her other son. So eventually, it was too late for her to change her mind a 6th time, and her son who was found was repatriated based on her initial wishes. And her other son was memorialized at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery on the walls of the missing there. So this is a story I encountered, but it took me months more to figure out the whole story, but it was all started by these 2 records we see here. Likewise, when I was at the ABMC doing my internship, we spent quite a bit of time in the John J. Pershing records in your collection. And we did this because Pershing was actually the first chairman of the ABMC. So we were trying to see, what did he write about and say, things like that related to his experience at the ABMC. And as I was digging through those files, I started seeing all sorts of papers about women. And I eventually went back using some keywords like the American War Mothers. And in those correspondence files, I found these examples of where Pershing had interacted with the women, like I mentioned earlier. So this one on the screen was a really big find for me. I got super excited. This is an image on the back of a flyer. The front of the flyer, it's just a bunch of words, so I didn't put it on the screen because nobody would be able to read it. But the front of the flyer basically talks about the American War Mothers organization and how each year they sold carnations to raise money for their various service projects, which included helping veterans, but also included raising money to create and support the house that you see on the back of that flyer, which was their memorial home situated at a veterans hospital in Colorado. And this was meant as a place for these women to be able to stay for a very cheap and affordable price while they went to visit their loved ones at the veterans hospital. General Pershing supported this carnation sale for many, many years, and he saved this flyer with this image on the back in his records. And I hadn't seen this in any of my other research. So it helped me really get more information about the carnation sale and this type of veteranist memorial. And in the same section of the Pershing papers, I also found a copy of the Indiana chapter of the American War Mothers' own organizational magazine. And this image was part of that magazine, which I hadn't seen anywhere else. And it shows a veteran holding a little baby with a woman that we can assume is his wife. And behind them, right, is a picture of a doughboy in action and the American Legion seal. And the bottom, it says, every son, a member of the American Legion, every mother, a member of American War Mothers. So that also gave me more insight into the connections between the American Legion and the American War Mothers. And I never would have found those documents if I hadn't really dug into Pershing's papers.
It's fascinating. And how long was this entire research project? You mentioned starting as an intern and then obviously publishing the book quite recently.
Probably about 8 years.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that not many people realize about the process of doing research is that it can often take much longer than we realize that these stories keep continuing and we keep finding new leads.
Exactly.
You had mentioned, Ellison, before that women were doing many things during World War One. And I know you focus on certain topics in your book, but could you talk a little bit about how, like more generally, they served the war effort in World War One?
Yes, this is really important, and we could do a whole talk for a couple hours on just this topic. So I'm still only going to give you the Cliff Notes version, but it's important to understanding my argument because women in World War One, they did activities that were considered quote unquote traditional for women, and then activities that at the time were considered untraditional. So when I talk about traditional activities, I'm thinking about things like knitting socks, sewing bandages, volunteering, and working as nurses. But as you can see on this slide, women also did more of the untraditional activities. They were working in factories, they were serving as telephone operators, they were actually working on male veterans' bodies as physical and occupational therapists, and they also were given a pretty amazing opportunity to fully enlist in the US Navy and the Marine Corps. World War I was the first time that women could fully and officially enlist in the military when the Secretary of the Navy at the time, Josephus Daniels, worked to figure out a loophole to get women to enlist, and they became known as Yeoman F. The F stood for female, and it was in little parentheses if you ever see it written out. Women also were able to serve in the Marine Corps, and there were a handful of women in the Coast Guard. And this is different than the women who were serving in the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps, because those women, while they were officially in the military, they were not enlisted. Now, bear with me for a minute, everybody, because this gets confusing, and it's supposed to be confusing. Women were serving in the military as Army nurses and Navy nurses, but they were not fully enlisted, and they didn't have real rank or authority over the men in their care. That's why those women in the Navy and the Marine Corps were the first to fully enlist. And if you're sitting here thinking, Allison, that makes absolutely no sense, you're correct. The point was that it didn't make sense, was that women served in this strange, liminal, powerless position in many ways in the military, but not equal to men, not enlisted, but still in the military. It's really weird. It's really confusing. What's important for my argument is that those women in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, the Yeoman F, and just bear with me, I'm going to get to another slide, and the Marines, they were all officially considered veterans. So you see them here, some female Yeoman F and Marinettes, female Marines. They didn't actually like being called that. Standing here with the Secretary of the Navy and FDR, who's standing up with his hat at his knee. So they were officially considered veterans. But a lot of other women who served in uniform and under oath were not considered veterans. These were women like the Hello Girls, who we see here on the screen as well. The Hello Girls, as our example, they were telephone operators who were bilingual in French and English, and they actually went overseas to France, were behind the lines, supporting US troops in dangerous situations, but they were considered civilians, even though they swore an oath, wore uniforms, and were working with the military. There was no provision, no other way for women to serve in the military. So gender restrictions created a whole community of women, like the Hello Girls, like the physical therapists, and others who worked for the military and were veterans, but did not officially receive any veteran status. And that's a big part of what I talk about in the book. And hopefully during this discussion, we can take a tangent break to talk a little bit about the Hello Girls, because I have a call to action for our audience members if you want to help out later and help restore their legacy.
Thank you, Allison. So how did you decide how to limit your book? How did you focus on the specific organizations or groups of women that make up the chapters of your book? The Women's Overseas Service League, American Red Cross, Reconstruction aides, American War mothers, Gold Star women. How did you narrow it down to focus on those groups?
I listened to the records and I tried to really focus on the records that had the holdings that were rich and multi-layered and gave me enough to write about. But I also had to make some decisions based on who I considered an unrecognized veteran. Because at first I was thinking that I could include a whole chapter on the National Yeoman F, which was the veterans organization of those Navy Yeoman F, those first enlisted women in the Navy. I was thinking that I could do a chapter on women who were actually given the opportunity to become members of the American Legion. So that would have included Navy Yeoman F, Marines, nurses. I had all sorts of big ideas. And then I realized that nobody wants to read a 600-page book. Very few people want to write a 600-page book. So I had to start making cuts. And the way I did that was by choosing to focus on these unrecognized veterans, the women who lacked official veteran status and had to fight to try, often unsuccessfully, to get the rights that they thought they had earned. So that was one way that I approached it. I really tried to let, again, the records speak to me. And that question of these veterans' benefits, it helped me focus on the Women's Overseas Service League because they acted as an umbrella organization for all sorts of women. So even though I didn't include a chapter just on the Hello Girls, many of them were members of the Women's Overseas Service League. So it tells the story of these diverse participants without having to do a chapter on every single type of occupation.
And to follow up on one of your previous points, Allison, like you use the term veteranist and veteranism quite a bit in your book, and it's one of the central arguments of your book. So can you talk a little bit more about how you came up with that term and what you mean by it?
Yes, well, I have to give credit to my PhD advisor, Dr. Saverio Giovacchini at the University of Maryland. When we were working on the dissertation, he told me, Allison, it's getting really wordy to talk about memorials that are focused on community service and advocacy. Because if you write that in a sentence every couple paragraphs, it's not readable. It really isn't readable. So he told me that I needed to create a neologism, a new word that could encapsulate what I was talking about so that I wouldn't bog down the narrative with this description. And what we realized was that the women I studied had their own philosophy about how to approach commemoration. And I want to be very clear, they never called it veteranism. They never said, I'm going to define what I'm doing as veteranism and I'm a veteranist. This is a tool that as a historian I created to help the reader be able to follow what I was saying more. So I created a name for their philosophy, but the philosophy itself was defined entirely through their own words. And the quote that really did it for me was the quote I shared earlier from the Women's Overseas Service League: "Our best memorial to the dead is our service to the living." And that really changed how I thought about these women. Instead of focusing on statues, they were focusing on service. They were impacted by the war in a way that made them question the normal commemorative techniques. And you see this written time after time in their records. You see it enacted through the projects that they pursued. And it really just made me think I needed a term to talk about it. And that maybe if I created a term to talk about it in the book, and maybe if it worked, then other historians could use it in their work. And maybe that would help us as cultural historians and military historians to think more creatively about what we consider to be a memorial. So once we do that, when we're doing our research, we might look at stuff that we would have overlooked before and say, hey, wait a second, maybe that is commemoration. Maybe what this group is doing is a way of memorializing. And I wanted to try and get other scholars, but also people in the community, people who are practicing commemoration, to think critically about what people did in the past, but also what we in the present day do to commemorate. Can we use veteranism in our commemorative activities today?
And I guess this is sort of a related question, specifically about the importance of the American Red Cross's Memorial Building, which is actually a physical building that, and in some ways, can be described as an invisible memorial to World War One, even though it's a prominent physical building in the heart of DC. So, what was the importance of that building? And maybe also talk a little more about who was Mabel Thorpe Boardman and her role in that building?
Yes, so I put the building back up on the
Mm.
screen. If anybody is local to DC or if you come to visit, it's pretty easy to find. It's off of 17th Street near the DAR. So it's at the Red Cross headquarters. And it's a living memorial building, which means it's a building that is created to house service activities. So it's a memorial that has life in it and serves a utilitarian purpose. And if you look at this image of the building, it's neoclassical. It's made of marble. It looks pretty grand and imposing, and it has these aesthetic similarities to statuary monuments and memorials. And that's why I argue that it's a hybrid. So it contained various rooms that were dedicated to service activities such as cutting, sewing, braille, working on sanitation, but all of it was done in this beautiful, pristine, neoclassical atmosphere. And I actually found quite a few photos in the Library of Congress in your collection about the creation of this memorial. So here you can see the cornerstone with the numbers 1928 being laid. I think that might be Mabel Thorpe Boardman at the podium, but it's not labeled. I think she looks kind of similar, but I cannot definitively prove that because it's a little bit too blurry and it's not labeled, but it could be her. So you see this group of people coming together to create a memorial that allowed the American Red Cross to serve others, which of course is at the heart of their mission. It was today, was then, and still is today. But what they ended up doing was each of these columns was utilized as an individual memorial. Organizations or people could give a donation for about $5,000 to purchase one of these columns, and then it would be inscribed at the bottom with an inscription of their choice, so that this building itself would have multiple individual monuments around its facade. So here we see General Pershing, again, connecting to the Pershing Papers, who is actually unveiling the American Legion's column on the very front, right by the door of the building. And again, I think that woman next to him is Mabel Boardman. Not labeled, so I can't prove it, but it certainly looks like her to me. And she was really the leader and the brains behind this project. So we see them unveiling the column. And then if you look on these slides, put your eyes, focus on those little red arrows. Hopefully you can see the inscription. The inscription on the front says, "To the mothers who gave their sons for their country." And then on the side, it says, "Given by the American Legion." So these columns are all over the front and two sides of the building, so that this memorial building, intended to house service activities, was a memorial that had memorials all over it. And then in the book, I'll give you just a preview, I talk about how one of those columns remained blank. And I have a whole theory about what may have happened that led to that blank column, which connects to the importance of veteranism. So you'll have to read the book to get that story, but I just want to show that to you here. And if you feel compelled to go take a look at the building, see if you can see those inscriptions, because some of them are really easy to see, but some of them are covered today by bushes or trees, and some of the actual original intention of this building has been lost. And so that brings up something that I have to mention, that veteranist memorials are not always permanent or stable, and they often get lost to history. And then we just have another image here of Mabel Boardman selling copies of a newspaper created by wounded soldiers at Walter Reed, so actually engaging in veteranism. So I found this again in the Prints and Photographs division from the Library of Congress, and it gave me more evidence of the way veteranism worked for these women. So she's selling newspapers, even before she's leading the creation of that memorial building.
Yeah, so speaking of wounded veterans and also service memorials, can you talk a little bit more about the reconstruction aids? I think that was one of the stories in your book that's just really fascinating.
Yes, the Reconstruction Aids chapter was a chapter that I found after I finished the dissertation. Ironically, I used the records at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring. I lived in Silver Spring, but didn't use the records until I moved out of Silver Spring. So that was frustrating and entirely my fault. But they have an incredible collection of records related to the Reconstruction Aids. Reconstruction aides were women who served as physical and occupational therapists. That's what we call them today. At the time, they were called reconstruction aides because they were reconstructing the bodies of the wounded from war. And after the war ended, they created their own veterans organization, which has a very wordy name. It's called the World War Reconstruction Aids Association. It's a mouthful. So these women, they were in the same situation as the Hello Girls, the Signal Corps telephone operators. They served as civilians, but they didn't realize that because they were in uniform, they were under oath, they were working alongside the military, but it turned out that they were not in the military after all. So their story is really inspiring, but also really disappointing. It's inspiring because these women were pioneers in physical and occupational therapy. If anybody out there has ever been to a physical therapist, I was there yesterday, you can count a lot of what you are learning as originating from the work that these women did during and after World War I. And actually, my physical therapists have told me that when they learn about the origins of their profession, they actually hear in PT school about the reconstruction aids. So these women really created what we know today as physical and occupational therapy. But it's really upsetting because they really had the short end of the stick. They were kind of screwed over by the government, to put it in not so nice terms. And we can start to unpack why. Here we see a certificate of identity for Lena Hitchcock, who's most likely this woman in the photo. This is a War Department certificate of identity. And if you look at this, you can start to get a sense of why these women were confused about their status when they came home from the war. She's wearing a uniform, she took an oath, she has this War Department certificate of identity attached to the Sanitary Service of the United States Army in capacity of reconstruction aid. For those of us who are not used to government paperwork, this can't blame them for thinking that they were in the military. So these women, they fought for years to try and gain veteran status. They lobbied Congress. They did everything that they could. One of them even wrote to General Pershing questioning why they were put in this position. And they did not succeed during their lifetimes for most of them. They disbanded their organization in 1949, basically said there's nothing else we can do. And it wasn't until the early 1980s that legislation was passed that gave them the status of having served on active service during the war. And by that time, most of them were no longer living. So they weren't able to take advantage of the few benefits that they got. The same thing happened to the Hello Girls. I think it was in 1979. They were finally given veteran status. And by that time, most of them had passed away. So it's a really sad story that does not end triumphantly.
Thanks, Allison. I wanted to ask you more about the Gold Star pilgrimages and how they fit into your definition of invisible memorials. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so the Gold Star pilgrimages, which I mentioned a little earlier in the presentation, were these trips that the government funded and organized to take Gold Star mothers and widows over to those overseas American cemeteries and memorials. And here we see a group of pilgrims in 1933 at the Montfaucon American Monument in France, which memorializes the Meuse-Argonne offensive. There's been a lot of great work written about the Gold Star pilgrimages, and what I did was I looked at them a little bit differently. I started to see through the words of the Gold Star mothers, through the text of the legislation, and other parts of the sources that many of these women considered the trips to be a memorial that honored both their dead children and husbands, but also honored them. The Gold Star pilgrimages, they were a way to memorialize the sacrifices of these women themselves. These women wrote about and expressed that their loss of their loved one was a type of national sacrifice. They lost their person in order to help the nation. And they believed that as part of what they had earned, they should be able to go see those graves. They should be able to go see those walls of the missing with their loved one's name on it. So I think about these like intangible memorials, a type of veteranist monument that honored the Gold Star women and their loved ones without actually creating a monument to them. And so here we can sort of see there are some tangible material culture vestiges of this Gold Star monument. We have the certificate of identification that was issued to each pilgrim. Here we have one from Estella M. Kendall that's in the collection of the National World War I Museum and Memorial. We also had some temporary rest houses that were built at the cemeteries. And I talk about these in much more detail in the book. To give you a bit of a preview, these were little vernacular houses that to me kind of look like bungalows that maybe you would see in American towns or at country clubs, very craftsman in style. They were built to give the women a place to use the restroom and have a cup of coffee or tea and privately take a rest while they were visiting these cemeteries, which was considered very strenuous for them. So these were erected during the pilgrims' visits and could be considered a type of memorial, but were then completely demolished and taken away with no traces of them there today, so that there's really little on the landscapes of these cemeteries that can tell you now that Gold Star women played a major role at them. And here you can see an African-American pilgrim at the Suresnes American Cemetery outside of Paris. And I bring this up because when we talk about the Gold Star pilgrimages, we have to talk about how they were racially segregated.
And could you tell us a little more about African American women in World War I commemorations?
Yeah, I think we can start with the Gold Star pilgrimages because we have this photo up already. Segregation really infected almost all of veteranist commemorations. So while I can praise veteranist commemorations and say it's something that we should look to in our own work today, there were stains on it because of prejudice and especially because of segregation. These Gold Star pilgrims, like the one we see here, they were invited to go on the trips, but only if they went in segregated groups. A lot of women protested. A lot of people protested. The NAACP was very upset. Some women decided not to go as a way to express their displeasure, and other women decided to go for various reasons. In the end, about 168 African American women went on these pilgrimages. Here we can see a group of them on a ship accompanied by an African American officer. They were asserting during the pilgrimages that their losses mattered and that their memory of both their children and the sacrifices they made mattered. So it's really interesting to look at their travels throughout France and England and to see these women, many of whom you can tell, the mothers especially, are very frail, probably never traveled very far from home, going overseas to make their mark and show that their loved ones had also served and died for their country. Even though they served in a segregated military, they were now traveling in a segregated trip, and once they got home, they would be faced again with all of the realities of segregation. So this really infuses a lot of what we see when we look at veteranists. Part of the issue was that segregation during the war meant that Black women had far fewer opportunities to serve in ways that would have allowed them to join these women veterans groups. So only about 2 or 3 Black women served overseas during the war. Here we see 2 of them. In the center, Addie Waits Hunton, and on her left, Catherine M. Johnson. They served overseas with the YMCA, and they actually wrote a book about their experiences. More women, more Black women came overseas after the war, but because of segregation, it meant that there were very few Black women who were eligible to join the Women's Overseas Service League. And then that organization basically said that they would segregate their units anyway. I haven't found any evidence of Black women joining the group. The American War Mothers, they segregated many of their chapters. They had a big argument that I talk about in the book at their national convention about whether they should segregate their chapters. And some women were up in arms, completely disgusted with the idea of racially segregated their ranks, while other women were adamant that they had to segregate, that segregation was the only way they could move forward. So I was able to find the records of segregated Black chapters of the American War Mothers at the Kentucky Historical Society. And here we see a picture of one of those chapters of Black mothers. So these mothers were dedicated to the ideals of serving and helping veterans and their families and other war mothers, even though they were segregated. And I think that this is really important because Black women were there, Black women were active, even in the face of racial prejudice.
Thank you, Allison, for that really detailed explanation. And I think we're going to have to skip some questions that we had for you, but maybe we can return to those. We'll see. But let's give the audience a chance to ask you some questions. I see that we have a few questions in the Q&A section. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to type your question in using the Q&A function in Zoom. So the first question we have is, could you explain the term Gold Star Mothers? And I think, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yes,
And
thank you.
also, the related question that I see, were there Gold Star pilgrimages after World War II? And if not, why not? So that's a related question.
Great question. So I'm going to go back to bring up an image. On this sheet music from the Library of Congress, the music division, you see this image of a flag. This is called a service star flag. And during World War I, these were hung in the windows, usually of homes, to indicate if a blue star was present in the center, that a family member was serving overseas. And eventually, if the worst happened and a service member passed away in service, that star would be a gold star instead of a blue star. The idea for the gold star was that people should not be going about wearing full Black mourning clothes like had been the tradition in the late 19th century. That morale would be better served by using a service star flag or an armband with a gold star to indicate that you were mourning a loved one who died in the service. So the gold star became emblematic and symbolic of anybody who lost someone they loved during the war. But mothers and widows became differentiated as Gold Star mothers and Gold Star widows because motherhood was so important at the time. And American culture really privileged motherhood that the Gold Star mothers, the ones who had given birth to the soldier or service member, were sort of elevated above others. I think that was the first part of the question. Did I miss the
Right.
second part
And
of the question?
the second part of the question was, were were there Gold Star pilgrimages in World War II?
No, there were not Gold Star pilgrimages after World War II. And it would be a great project out there for somebody to research why. I haven't found a ton of information about why. I can theorize. My theory is that motherhood was considered such an exceptional service during the World War I era that by the time you get to World War II, motherhood, while still elevated, is looked at differently. By the time we get to World War II, women have progressed a little bit more, not a ton, but a little bit more, and they're given more opportunities to serve, which I talk about in the conclusion of the book, that mothers are not held out to be as special. Same with widows, right? So I think that's my main explanation, but it's a good topic for somebody to write a dissertation on if there's any graduate students out there, or an article. But no, there were not pilgrimages after World War II. It was a one-time experience.
And another related question, was it only mothers who could go on those pilgrimages? And I think you answered that. That was also widows as well. And if the mother had passed, did they ask a sibling, like the oldest daughter?
So it was mothers and widows only, but the widow had to be unremarried, which complicates things because if you were an unremarried widow, you were younger than the Gold Star mothers, most likely. You may have had children to support, so maybe you had to get a job, or maybe you needed to get remarried to support your children. So that was somewhat controversial at the time. It also kind of punishes a woman who's a widow for deciding to remarry after losing her spouse to wartime. So there's a lot that we could make of that. But no, you could not substitute somebody else. You couldn't substitute a husband or a sibling. It was only mothers and only unremarried widows.
And another question, do you talk about quilts in your book at all?
I don't talk about quilts, but that's a fantastic idea. And if you have any ideas about quilts or want to share something, you can find my website and send it to me. I would love to look at quilts.
Allison, could you give your quick 30-second pitch on how people might be able to help recognize the Hello Girls?
Yes. So the Hello Girls are there's an attempt happening right now by the Doughboy Foundation, an organization dedicated to the memory of World War I, to honor the Hello Girls with the Congressional Gold Medal. And we actually now have enough sponsors in the Senate and the House to do this. So it's just a matter of moving the legislation forward. There's a link, which I shared with our experts, which will probably go into the chat. So you can write to your representative, to your senator, to tell them that you want to support the Hello Girls Congressional Gold Medal effort. Many other groups of women have been given this medal, like the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion is one example. There's no reason that we shouldn't be honoring them. It's far too late for them to see during their own lifetimes that they're being honored, but honoring them would give a message to America's service members and women today that we are not going to forget them.
So thank you. And we got a message from Catherine. Thank you very much for mentioning the Hello Girls CGM campaign.
Thank you, Catherine. We're really close, guys. So this is something that we can all do together to honor all of these women I talked about in the book today. This is a way that we can actually help restore their legacy. So contact your representative, contact your senator.
And speaking of legacy, do you want to just mention really quickly how the women, how remembering women from the World War I generation really worked to benefit the World War II generation and future generations of women that served? Do you want to just mention that quickly?
Yeah, so this is something that, again, you can turn to the book for the full story, but a lot of women from World War I, they ended up being in positions during World War II that helped them fight for those women to have better status and opportunities than they did. So chief among them is Representative Edith Norris Rogers. She served overseas during World War I. She was an unrecognized veteran. And when she was in Congress, she made it her mission to ensure that women would get better status. So she introduced legislation for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and then the Women's Army Corps. The Women's Army Corps, the WAC, was what really changed things because that actually made women a part of the military. It made them fully fledged members who were eligible for veterans benefits after the war. So it was a female, unrecognized World War I veteran who helped pave the way for women to have all the opportunities that they didn't have during the First World War. And we even see here Captain Violet Hill Gordon, who was a member of the WAC in that 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, which of course was still segregated at the time. So really, the women of today's military owe it to these unrecognized veterans from World War I that they have these opportunities, that women keep progressing in the military because these other women who are so often forgotten were fighting for them, even when they knew they weren't going to get those rights themselves.
Thank you so much, Allison. I think that was a great way to end our discussion. I think we've just about run out of time. So I think this discussion was really great, and I hope people go out and take a look in more detail at your book. Um, and it was really wonderful to discuss your research process, your arguments, and the collections that you use here at the Library of Congress. Thank you to everyone who attended today's Made at the Library event. If you have additional questions, please send those to the Ask a Librarian link, which I believe will be posted in the chat. And you can send questions there and we can direct them to the appropriate people here at the library. Um, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.